Welcome to Beyond Pain and Fatigue, where we explore the complexities of chronic pain, fatigue, and invisible illnesses through meaningful conversations. Whether you're a healthcare professional looking to learn more about supporting people with these conditions in the clinic, or a patient looking for understanding and practical advice, this podcast is for you. Join us as we bring together research, professional insights, and lived experience to help gain different perspectives, new ways of thinking about pain and fatigue to help transform care.
This podcast is produced by co-hosts Sophie and Ollie in their capacity as clinicians at Vive Pain and Fatigue. Please note that while we do provide clinical services through our clinic, this podcast is intended for educational purposes only and should not be taken as direct medical advice. Please always consult with your own healthcare providers for recommendations suitable for your unique circumstances. For more information about our clinic and the services that we offer, please visit vivepainfatigue.com.au.
Make sure to follow and subscribe for new episodes and check out our blog at Vive Pain and Fatigue for written episode summaries and resources.
Please note that this podcast may involve discussion of a range of topics relating to chronic pain, fatigue, and invisible illnesses, which may include conversations about negative healthcare experiences, distress, trauma, or feature real experiences of patients living with these conditions. Because of this, there is potential for some listeners to find certain episodes or topics distressing.
Please refer to the episode descriptions for specific content warnings and for further links for mental health support and resources. You are not alone.
Welcome to our very first episode of Beyond Pain and Fatigue. I am super excited to welcome everyone here, but also to welcome my co-host, Ollie Crossley. Hi, Ollie.
Hey, Soph. It's nice to be here.
We're super excited to launch this podcast and have everyone join us for these conversations about pain, fatigue, and invisible illnesses. And really, this first episode is just to say hello to everyone, give people a bit of an idea as to what to expect from us. And so, explore what the future holds for the podcast and potential topics and things that we'll be covering, but also to, I guess, introduce ourselves a bit so that people can get a bit of a sense of where we've come from and what led us to the podcast in the first place. So I'm really excited to dive into that. So I guess to throw it to you first, Ollie, how did you get here? Tell us a bit about you.
Yeah, good question. I think like yourself and like many who have lived experience with these conditions, especially when you work as a clinician in any form, you come to this place out of a need for something that you wish you had. And the learning journey, the things I've tried, and now how you and I help people with these different conditions is out of our own lived experience, I think, primarily. And then obviously our love of science and research and making healthcare fair and effective.
Yeah, absolutely. In terms of your professional background, maybe tell us a little bit more about, your training and I guess from a clinical perspective, how you've gotten to here.
For sure. I think where I got to from here was a mixture of having a background in yoga and I guess mindfulness way before I became a physio. A lot of people have heard me talk about this story on social media and things like that, but it was really just a love of coming across yoga and meditation practice, particularly, within a Buddhist tradition when I was backpacking in India. And then, 10 years later, going through a physio degree and being curious about how the two worlds could merge together, that I found myself fascinated by the problem of persistent pain and then fatigue and invisible illnesses, and seeing how they're all connected and how these practices that I knew and loved so well can start to, not necessarily cure people or be the sole solution, but be a very useful part of their healing journey.
How do you feel like that has led to, I guess, your journey in terms of your training and I guess where you kind of ended up? Because I know that you obviously went through your physio training, but then you also had started a psychotherapy degree. Did that sort of come from those learnings and those reflections?
Yeah, it did. And lots of yogis out there will know this, and I think people, especially with invisible illnesses, is that the the mind-body connection and the fact that they're basically two sides of the same coin just becomes increasingly evident. And it did for me. And I think it was a frustrating part of being just a physio in inverted commas, in the early stages, people coming in with different musculoskeletal issues as I work in a private practice, as I know you did as well, and being frustrated at the limits of what could be done to help people, and especially around the seeing that people's beliefs and worldviews and the psychological side of things had such an important role, it was such an important factor in people's experience and determining their, I guess, their disability or recovery, and learning more about that's been a big part of my journey, and how I've come to meet people like yourself and others studying acceptance and commitment therapy, and like you said, beginning to do some subjects in a masters of psychotherapy, because I find the better we can talk with and meet people where they're at, what people think of as physiotherapy can work better.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know you touched on before that you had mentioned that you've got some lived experience, with this as well. If you're comfortable to share, would you mind, maybe sharing a little bit about that experience?
Yeah, definitely. I guess chronic fatigue syndrome, myalgic encephalomyelitis, ME/CFS is that broad label that felt truest for me, and it was dips in and out of it in various circumstances over the last 12 years. Initially, like many, it was after a viral illness, what I thought was glandular fever at 18 years of age, and then came out of that okay. Then again, Ross River fever, funnily enough, living in Townsville where Ross River actually is. So it was always like mosquito-borne viruses, Barmer forest virus, being hit with those again and again, and just being really knocked around and not having any really solid reason why, as many of us do. You go to a GP, you get blood tests, they can't find anything wrong, but you just find yourself being abnormally exhausted from what you would consider minimal exertion. And it wasn't even physical, right? Like at university studying, being just wrecked and having to sleep all day or not being able to do what I could usually handle. And I think again, it came to a point with getting COVID like many of us had, and then getting long COVID and trying to manage that and being really affected by it, and lots of my friends being really affected by it and trying to make sense of what was going on. And since seeing the intersections between these conditions and hypermobility, or for myself, neurodivergence, and understanding that was a big part of it, along with the more biological viral pathology. But it's something that's really like there's some themes I think that people share, but everyone's got quite an individual part. And I must say, I actually haven't heard what yours was like, or how your fatigue experience occurred. Where did it start for you, Soph?
Yeah, so I actually ended up with, similar to you, so I ended up with ME/CFS, chronic fatigue syndrome was the language I had around it at the time. I can't remember exactly how old I was, but I feel like I must have been about 14 or 15. And I ended up with glandular fever or Epstein-Barr, whatever you want to call it, was quite unwell with the acute infection. Like I ended up spending a couple of days in hospital just because I was just so unwell and couldn't really, drink water or eat or, do much. So I remember being in hospital and feeling just absolutely rubbish at the time. And, I think particularly when you're that young and you maybe don't have much else of a frame of reference, you kind of think, cool, I'll be sick for a few days and then I'll be sweet. But for me, that kind of then kicked off this sort of period of, it lasted a good several years where I would still say, in the scheme of things and with knowing what I know now about the range of experiences that people have, I would say I had quite a mild case of ME/CFS. Like that's not to say it didn't feel terrible and that I wasn't quite limited by it. I really, for several years after that, was in a point where I would go to school and then I would come home and I would crash and sleep for, most of the afternoon. And I really couldn't do anything that exerted myself. Like, school was kind of the priority because it had to be. And then I didn't have capacity outside of that. So if I tried to, go out on the weekend, or I, went to go meet up with friends, or even just going through a particularly stressful period at school, like if there was lots of assignments due or a lot happening all at once, it would just trigger this big flare of fatigue and I would just crash, and I was getting like this recurrent sort of viral experience. So that went on for a good few years. It was really bad for the first, year or so, I would say. And then I kind of had a bit of an improvement in that I still had to be quite careful about how much I would do all at once. And I definitely noticed coming into year 12, periods of stress and poor sleep and lots of other things. If I was not looking after myself, I really would still hit those crashes. But it kind of improved a bit and I was sort of just managing and sort of coping as best I could. And then weirdly enough, I sort of had for years had been, agitating to have my tonsils out because that was part of what I presented with when I would get these recurrent things. And I had my tonsils out and, that seemed to help me a lot. So it didn't magically fix it, but it seemed to alleviate some of the, I guess some of the burden of it, and it made things feel a little bit more manageable, and I was kind of able to get on a little bit more of a positive trajectory from there. So I would say now I wouldn't consider myself to necessarily have chronic fatigue syndrome now. I wouldn't say that I have it in that sense. It's largely in remission, I would say. But what I do find is that I still can be quite sensitive to periods of time where I might have heaps going on, or, if I do go through a particularly stressful period where I'm just like not sleeping and I'm not looking after myself, I can be prone to having these like kind of fatigue crashes that last several days. The body pain's kind of reminiscent of what I used to get, but thankfully my tolerance for day-to-day activities has improved a lot. So that was kind of my experience with it. But I've been asked before, like, did that experience kind of lead me clinically to where I am?
But yeah, you're reading my mind. Well, how did
Yeah.
that then, inform your journey through uni and into being a clinician?
Oh, look, like uni was quite hard because during that time I was still kind of bouncing back, and I'd had my tonsils out pretty early on at uni. And so I'd started that recovery process through uni, but there was still, definitely challenges with that. Yeah, I mean, I wish I could say that the personal experience with ME/CFS was like what sent me on this journey to being a physio and ending up where I am. But weirdly enough, it kind of wasn't a conscious thing. What actually happened was I initially got into physio because I really struggled with figuring out what I wanted to do. I knew I wanted to do something that involved people, and I had contemplated doing medicine, and I, coming from a rural town, had just seen how tough it is to be a GP in particular. And I kind of, knowing my experience with fatigue at that point, part of me was like, I don't know if I can, hack this if I were to go into it. So I was looking for different options, and I ended up going into physio because I got really interested in actually more the neuro side of things, I guess. Like I was fascinated by neuro rehab and the role of the brain, and that always, piqued my interest. When I went through uni, I remember like we do tutorials and stuff on different case studies, and it was kind of almost like several times classmates had joked that like anything to do with like the brain or the nervous system, like that was what I was interested in. So I kind of maybe was a bit different to the typical, like I would say like what probably most physios go into physio thinking, which is I want to do sports physio and I want to do musc physio. And that kind of evolved into an interest in chronic pain and persistent sort of symptoms, and that whole complexity just really drew me in. And so I kind of went down the pain track, and that's where I ended up doing my sort of my pain titling and my postgrad study and masters in that area. And it was then as I went down that pathway that I really started to open up into these crossovers that exist between fatigue symptoms and pain, and realizing that so much of the neurobiology, but also the sort of approaches we need to take are so consistent. And so I sort of almost stumbled into the area and then went, oh, this is interesting because I've been through this. And like, having those reflections you mentioned before about how when you've been through it and you can kind of see like knowing what you wish you had had at that point, like I think that was something that really hit home for me, because I just remember reflecting back on my experience, and it was effectively at that point, through no one's fault. It was just that we didn't really have much knowledge or awareness of how to manage it at that point. And yeah, it was kind of just like, look, you're just going to have to kind of manage how much you're doing and wait it out, basically. Like that was kind of the extent of the management, I guess, that I had. And thankfully, I count myself in the lucky minority who did have, somewhat of a spontaneous sort of resolution over time. It did take a long time, but I know there's a lot of people out there who aren't as fortunate. So it's been really nice to end up back there.
Totally, yeah. And I guess that gives us a nice segue into some of the things that we're going to speak about in subsequent episodes, that these specific conditions like ME/CFS, long COVID, and various forms of persistent pain and other invisible illnesses. So we're going to really dive into, what we do know now, and not only what's helped us in our own lived experience, but those of our clients, and some of the research that we're lucky to have, but obviously we would like more of. There's this, a need to go beyond, I guess. So why did we call this Beyond Pain and Fatigue, Soph? Because this was certainly one of your brilliant ideas.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, look, I think I think there's probably a couple of interpretations, right? I think definitely as a starting point, I think coming to this idea that we're really trying to see beyond just the symptoms, right? I think there's very much a focus on pain or fatigue as an isolated symptom. And I think, getting that broader picture, both clinically and for patients too, as to like, if we zoom out and we kind of look at that person as a whole person, but also within their context, we know that there's so much more we need to consider when we're trying to support people who have pain or fatigue, or if you're a person who's living with pain and fatigue themselves, actually being able to take that bigger picture approach, I think is really important. And I think too, you touched on the invisible illness side of things, and I guess it might be a helpful point for us to jump in and maybe talk a little bit about our clinical context, which for the purposes of giving everyone listening an idea as to, I guess, where we're coming from. I guess, do you want to maybe give an idea as to the clinic, Ollie?
Sure. So I always love explaining the clinic, because it's online, it's telehealth, and it sounds a bit odd to what people usually think of as physiotherapy, but for those who experience the conditions that we're talking about, and for those that are seeing some of the best science that we've got coming out lately, being online and being able to access high quality care from home or from where you have internet is really one of the best ways to go about it. And so Soph and I work on different edges of the country in Australia, but it's like being in the same clinic with each other every day. We're lucky to chat and help people.
Just to jump in there, Ollie,
yes.
Where do you mind sharing where you're from?
Yeah, for sure. So I'm very lucky to live in what's right now the sunny Gold Coast on the east coast of Australia in Queensland, and but Vive was not born there. It comes from the lovely town of Wagga. So hometown.
Absolutely. So I'm living in Wagga, and we definitely did start in Wagga. We were running I was running a physical clinic, and up until earlier this year, it was just me by my lonesome. But I've been very lucky to welcome you, Ollie. So it's been fabulous having you as part of the team, and I think that's been the really interesting thing moving to telehealth. The clinical shift and how do we sort of translate this stuff into the telehealth setting has been really, really interesting and fascinating to kind of explore. But it's also been really wonderful as well, because it's meant that we've had so much flexibility. We've been able to reach people who maybe otherwise wouldn't have access to us in a physical clinic, but also we can tap into people like yourself who are, living on opposite sides of the country, and well, maybe not opposite sides, but a fair way away. And so that has offered up a lot more flexibility. But it's been interesting to, like you said, almost explaining what we do has been interesting, because the idea of telehealth physio feels quite foreign, and it's talking through what that actually looks like. I don't think it necessarily matches with what a lot of people would suspect, and it's probably because we do work in quite a transdisciplinary sort of way that it maybe doesn't look super close to what physio typically would, but it's also not as simple as us just sitting down and explaining pain at people all
No,
day,
it's
every
not.
day.
There's a word there that I know is one of your favorites, and maybe it can be a nice point in how you can explain what a session might look like with one of us. Transdisciplinary. What does that mean, and then how does that show up in a consult at Vive Pain and Fatigue?
Yeah, sure. So transdisciplinary is a word that sort of comes from, I guess, maybe more of my PhD related work, but it's really just a word that we use to describe not necessarily working in a way that's isolated to any one discipline. So, if we're talking, it can be applied in the context of professions. So, we might be talking about working in a very physioscope, that might be more sort of one discipline. And so, transdisciplinary care in the context of pain is sort of then talking about, I guess, moving beyond that really rigid idea of what it looks like from just a physio lens and sort of starting to draw on different self-management skills and education that maybe kind of crosses across disciplinary boundaries. And I think that's really important when we're talking about pain, because we know that from our current sort of research and best practice guidelines that to manage pain and fatigue effectively, we kind of need that interdisciplinary approach. We know that getting different perspectives and different supports involved is often really important to help people move forward. And we also know that there's a huge problem with getting that happening in practice as well. Like the Pain Australia national strategic action plan that came out in the last few years highlighted that anywhere up to 80% of people in Australia can't access appropriate care, which is just huge. And one of the challenges we have is finding enough professionals who are available to fill those gaps. So I kind of started Vive after coming from private practice in more of a typical Musk sports setting, because I found that I was just getting it was a real challenge to figure out how to work, knowing and understanding more about pain and figuring out how do we translate this in a way that makes sense, that is actually helpful to patients, that helps to kind of recognize some of those broader barriers that might exist for people in terms of accessing support. So that was kind of the drive. So when we're talking about transdisciplinary care, it means we're kind of not, I think fundamentally starting from the perspective of the person and working backwards from that and going, okay, what support does this person need? Where are these opportunities to help move them forward? But then from there, working out what of that support can we help provide? And we do, often take quite a holistic approach to it. And we'll work on a lot of these other areas that, maybe wouldn't be as typical for a physio to help support, but also flagging when people then do need additional supports and facilitating those referrals when they do need more expertise in certain areas. So it does look quite different. So yeah, it's just been really interesting to see that translate. And I think to have you come on board as well. I mean, obviously, for those of you, if it hasn't been clear, I'm Ollie's boss technically, which feels weird to say because it doesn't feel that way sometimes. It's very, from my end, it feels very collaborative, but
It is.
it's yeah, I mean, I'm interested to, and this might maybe be getting into maybe more of an in-depth episode down the track, but, just how you found moving between settings and, that shift in practice in terms of different ways of working. What has that kind of been like for you?
It's been very challenging, like I think it has been for every physio, every clinician out there that is trying to meet the needs of people in the space that are, not easily fitting into the single silo of one particular profession. But I think what's nice is that I've been doing it, within scope of practice, and we'll talk about what that even means in coming episodes and how that can be flexibly reviewed. But I've been doing it as a secret agent, I think, for so long, giving out breathing exercises here and there, from like applying the yoga stuff in a more clinical setting, learning, different ways of approaching clinical conversations around taking on psychotherapeutic ideas. Acceptance and commitment therapy has such a wonderful place in physio, and weaving that in as I worked in sports or more, classic physio clinics, where people came in with, sore backs and sprained ankles. But now I think what's been so nice is since coming on board with you, Sophie, is being able to do that very explicitly and wearing it with pride has been really refreshing and rewarding, because I really think it's how things should be. And it's also to say, I think that, we're not trying to be a doctor, we're not trying to be the psychotherapist, but, to briefly say that we of course respect those different skill sets and professions, but it's that people's needs can be better met if we flexibly adjust how we see ourselves and what skill set we have.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, that probably almost leads us to, I guess a pretty interesting question. What are the things that kind of led us here, or what are we hoping to gain from having this podcast available?
Well, for me, we've had so many epic discussions with just you and I, or with other, fellow clinicians, that I very selfishly just want other people to listen in on them, because I learn so much. I figure everyone else can as well. So such a bastion of knowledge and wisdom in this space, and it's lovely to learn from you. But I think also just that this space it's getting better, but there's such a dearth of information and perspectives, not just from the clinical side of things, but from the lived experience. And being able to integrate those as you have so skillfully done for so long is really important, and to spread awareness, spread the knowledge that this kind of care is the standard and can be accessed by anyone.
Yeah.
What I mean, because you've been wanting, the podcast idea has been simmering in your brain for a long time, but what triggered it? What made you go, let's start?
I will point out from the get-go that I very specifically asked you to try and talk me out of doing a podcast, and here we are. So
yeah, I failed.
But that's okay. We're here now, and it's very exciting. Yeah, look, I'd been thinking about it for a while, because I think what stuck out for me was that, particularly even just looking at purely the pain space, that there's often, there are some really great podcasts out there, and there are some resources that are brilliant. But I think for me, the thing that I always struggled to find or to tap into was the really real practical insights, or the real world perspectives on stuff. So, you might find, podcasts or resources that talk about maybe more of the heavy science or the research on interventions. But what I felt was that there was often this big sort of translation gap, where if you were just working in clinical practice in a private setting, not necessarily private, but maybe just one-on-one, not necessarily in a multidisciplinary team, how do you kind of take what we know about the complexity of pain and fatigue, and then what does that actually mean in terms of clinical practice, and how can we use it meaningfully to shape practice and to make sure that we're actually helping people better? So for me, that was kind of a huge gap that I've always had in the back of my mind. But I think particularly in recent years, particularly since going out on my own and setting up Vive, the area, for context, our clinic sees a huge range of, clinical conditions. Ollie can probably attest to that, and probably felt a bit confronting probably initially to walk in and go, okay, there's all of this happening. But we see maybe more of the typical sort of persistent pain presentations, where we might get sort of chronic musculoskeletal pain, low back pain, maybe work cover related injuries. But I think increasingly my area of interest, and Ollie, I think, yours too probably, has really been shifting towards some of these lesser understood conditions, conditions that are often very common within sort of our persistent pain populations, but don't get picked up. There's not great recognition. So particularly, hypermobility disorders, Ehlers-Danlos syndromes, dysautonomias and POTS, ME/CFS, all of these conditions that are so common in pain and often present with pain. And these are people who are coming through the pain clinics, they're coming through primary care, but these conditions don't get particularly well recognized or picked up. And then the management as a result is often not as ideal as it can be. And there's actually a lot of people, I would say, that we see in our clinic who have actually had symptoms for quite a while, and often some of their experiences with healthcare have actually been harmful because of that lack of awareness of these conditions and how they do need to be managed differently. So I think particularly in that end, creating a space for more discussion around some of these lesser known conditions sharing some of the research, sharing some of the, I guess, the research backing, but then also from a practical sense, how we can kind of support translating that to practice and what that looks like, and keeping it really practical for people, for clinicians who are working in the area. But I think also, I know we've had some conversations about this as well, but just not privileging that information in terms of who we assume it's for, because I think, we've spoken about this. I'd be keen to hear you talk about it a bit as well, but just our assumptions we make and where resources are often geared towards, I think, is something that we want to play with.
Yeah, like Sophie and I say this a lot in our conversations with each other, but it's that sitting there going, as we talk about these conditions or different ideas, we assume, and I think rightfully so, that the person, the patient, they're just as well-read or, even science literate around the specific pathophysiology or things that you can do rehab-wise than most clinicians out there. And so what we want from the start, and I guess this is the beginning of some of our ground rules as to how we want to work through these topics and episodes, is that whether you're a clinician or whether you're someone with lived experience or helping a family member or friend even, all are welcome and all are equally as valid a source of information and wisdom, so that we can bring together a shared experience of learning and hopefully just better care and outcomes for everyone involved.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that speaks really nicely to what we're kind of hoping that the podcast will be. And of course, like, this is early days. We fully expect that stuff's going to evolve as we get going. But to have this space where it's not just about, coming in from that very health professional focused aspect and making it about what the health professional can do for someone, but to actually, create a space of this sort of shared knowledge and to bring in different perspectives, because I think those lived experiences from people with these conditions are so valuable for us to be able to listen to, because yes, while we might be more inclined to kind of prioritize some of the more structured scientific research, and that's where we base a lot of our practice on, evidence-informed, evidence-based practice, that's where a lot of it's drawn from. But I don't think we challenge enough the assumptions around some of that. And what we often don't appreciate is that there's a huge difference between what we can kind of look at in a lot of clinical trials to how that then sort of travels through the pipeline of, accessibility and acceptability and, the actual enactment in practice. And so how it plays out in the real world is often very different. And if we're not actually appreciating the experiences of people who are out there in the world living with these conditions, and also not appreciating the experiences of, everyday clinicians who are working in these areas, it's going to make it really challenging to work out ways of doing that are actually fit for purpose. And we kind of end up in this very sort of overly structured or restrictive way of practice. So, we're going to be looking at really making sure we can get more people's experiences on. Some of our upcoming episodes, we've got plans, very exciting, to, have guests on who can speak about their own lived experience with these conditions, to start to give some insights as to what that's like, but also what their experience with the health system have been like, and what they wish they had, as they were going through, because I think those learnings are so valuable for anyone, and to prompt ideas and different ways of thinking. So yeah, I think that that's going to be really exciting. And as much as we can, while I totally anticipate we're going to have some episodes that will probably be a little bit more maybe clinician oriented, just because of the, I guess, the technical aspect of something. There might be episodes where we do more of a deep dive that's maybe more appropriate for clinicians. I think as much as we can, we're hoping we can, aim it at both health professionals and people with living with these conditions, and that everyone can kind of benefit from it.
Totally, yeah. And I think the only thing that really gets in the way there, and this is something Sophie and I'll be mindful of, is that the profession-specific lingo, that people don't often understand, not through a lack of any capacity to, just often exposure. And so as we explain some of these more complex topics and nitty-gritty science areas, that it's going to be, we're going to make it really accessible and in a language that anyone can come at it from, because that's where I think science can work the best. And it's really what why I think Sophie and I, one of the main reasons why Sophie and I are so excited to start this and run it is that science, especially when it comes to science for around persistent pain and invisible illness, understanding the pathophysiology or treatment, is that it has so much more promise. It can do so much more for people if it's more inclusive, if it's more equitable, if it takes into account the lived experience and the unique contextual struggles of each person that lives with one of these diagnoses or syndromes.
Yeah, absolutely. You want to maybe, give people a bit of an idea as to what episodes might start to look like and as the podcast shapes up?
Definitely. So I get to chat with Sophie each week around random things, and we often talk for thankfully far too long. It's sort of my favorite parts of the job, aside from talking with clients. And we're going to have these catch-up episodes where it's like, what's going on? What are we learning? Pretty relaxed, as if you're sitting in on one of our regular weekly meetings. But like Sophie said, we're also privileged to know a lot of really brilliant people who have lived experience in these conditions, and or who are clinicians or researchers themselves, and often have a foot in each camp, that they have lived experience or they're researchers. So we'll get experts and people to come on and share their wisdom with us. But also we're going to cover some specific conditions, because so many of you out there find it hard to access simple, practical, as Sophie said, actionable information on what to do. And whilst it will always be, with the disclaimer that you'll need to talk to an individual clinician to make it relevant for you, we want to provide general information that helps people manage better. So around whether it's POTS or whether it's MECFS or hypermobility and different forms of Ehlers-Danlos syndromes.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think to be able to, give some of that more structured, insight into, clinical interventions or clinical conditions, but also very much maintaining that conversation around it, because I think the last thing that Ollie and I would ever want to do is to come in and be like, this is the authoritative opinion on what is correct. And, because, the whole, really we want to be making sure that throughout we're taking this sort of, critical lens to what we're talking about. So it's very much about getting those different ideas and perspectives, and yes, being critical, but bringing it back to these sort of practical insights, and trying to get greater insight from that.
Yep. Well, I guess if there's any, with the upcoming episodes that we have planned, so what are you most excited for?
Oh, so much. I have a few that I'm quite excited about, honestly. I think our initial lineup of things we've got to record, there's so much to discuss that, it's hard to narrow it down. But I'm really looking forward to our discussion, which I think at this stage might even be our very first one, which is going to be talking about pain neuroscience education and the different perspectives on that. Because I think that's going to be fascinating, and honestly, probably a good example of what we're hoping the podcast will be able to be, which will be a space for kind of thinking critically and adopting many different perspectives to try and really consider deeply at different levels, rather than kind of just getting stuck in one view of things. So I think it'll be really lovely to explore that, and at the risk of it being potentially a little bit, controversial, because I feel like pain education is always one of those sort of sensitive topics. I'm really excited to dive into that. What about you, Ollie? What are you most excited for?
Well, definitely that episode, because we've got to keep things spicy. But I'm always, for those of you that don't know me, fascinated by allostatic load, the science of how the physiology of stress shows us that mind and body, as I said before, aren't really separate, that they're the same thing, and that psychological experiences have physiological bases, and vice versa, and how that's relevant for pain, because these are things that we work with clinically every day with our clients, and exploring the science of complexity. So much that I've learned from you and others around getting comfortable with uncertainty, and how that can actually paradoxically make things better for outcomes for clients, and also outcomes for us as clinicians too.
It's actually so hard to narrow it down. That question of like, what are you most excited for? Because I'm literally looking, all of the things. I'm looking at our topic, our plan for the next few episodes, and I'm like, oh, this all just excites me. So we're really keen to hear from people if there's particular sort of topics or questions that crop up, whether you're a clinician and you're sort of, reflecting on your clinical experience and things that you want to know to help you better support clients, but also, if you're a patient or someone who's living with these conditions, if there's something that you feel has been hard to tap into information about, we're really keen to hear from you. And I mean, Ollie and I have spoken a lot about our clinic, Vive Pain and Fatigue, and that's where kind of the podcast is being created in our capacity as clinicians in the clinic. But I guess the thing that I think is really important for us to emphasize is that this podcast, it's not about us coming in and pushing, we've contextually spoken about what our clinic does today, but, our goal is not to make it about our clinical services and not to make like, what we're doing, giving specific advice and education for people. It's really to help share some of this knowledge and education in a way so that a broader audience of people can be aware of it, start talking about it, start having conversations, and hopefully can kind of create a space for us to be having more creative conversations about what this looks like in practice. I'll be very forthcoming in saying I only know how I've gone about it because I went from working in a general private practice into setting up my own practice, where I've kind of found my way and I've fallen into a rhythm of, how I do stuff. But I know contexts are so different, and, even just people's ways of working and skill sets are different. So I think that's something I'm really looking forward to as well, is just exploring different ways of thinking, different ways of doing, and how do we do it in a way that's most going to help people who are living with pain, fatigue conditions.
Here. Yep. I'm looking forward to that. Well, if this is something that you'd like to come along and join us along the journey for and listen along, then don't forget to subscribe to anywhere that your podcasts come from. And also check us out on social media, Instagram, Facebook, or the upcoming YouTube channel that this will probably start after this video. So thanks for joining us today. I'm really looking forward to chatting with you more, Soph, and our guests that we've got lined up.
Yeah, thanks, Ollie. Really looking forward to where this goes. So thanks, everyone, and hopefully we'll see you all tuning in for our next episode.
See you then.